The bullet grazed Thomas Fletcher's shoulder as he dove behind the overturned wagon, and in that split second between life and death, he thought not of his reputation as the hardest man in Aurora, Colorado, but of how stupid it would be to die over someone else's fight. It was 1878, and the summer heat beat down on the dusty main street where three bank robbers were making their messy escape, firing wildly at anyone who moved. Thomas had been minding his own business, leading his horse to the livery after 3 weeks on the trail when the shooting started. Now, here he was, bleeding and angry, watching townspeople scatter like tumbleweeds in a storm. He drew his revolver with practiced ease, the weight of it familiar in his calloused hand. Thomas Fletcher had earned his reputation the hard way, through countless cattle drives, barroom brawls, and that ugly business with the cattle rustlers 2 years back. At 28, he was already considered one of the most dependable ranch hands in the territory, and the most unapproachable. Men respected him. Women found him handsome but intimidating. Children crossed the street when they saw him coming. Though he had never once raised a hand to anyone who did not deserve it, the shooting intensified, and Thomas heard a woman scream from inside the general store. His jaw tightened. He counted 3 shooters, all moving toward their horses tied near the store. If they made it out of town, they would likely get away clean. The sheriff was 3 counties over, helping with a murder investigation, and his deputy was barely 20, probably hiding somewhere sensible. Thomas made his decision in an instant. He broke from cover, moving low and fast, years of working with spooked cattle making him quick despite his size. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water in winter. His face was all hard angles, weathered from sun and wind, with a scar along his jaw from where a horse had kicked him when he was 17. The first robber never saw him coming. Thomas hit him hard, sending the man sprawling into the dirt, his gun flying from his hand. The second one wheeled around, raising his weapon, but Thomas was faster. His shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The third robber, seeing his companions down, made a run for it on foot, leaving the stolen money behind. Thomas let him go. He was not interested in being a hero. He holstered his gun and turned to check on the 2 downed men, making sure they were no longer threats. The one he had tackled was out cold. The one he had shot was groaning, clutching his shoulder. Good enough? That was when he heard the crying. It was coming from inside the general store, not a woman's cry, but something smaller, more desperate. Thomas moved toward the sound, his boots heavy on the wooden boardwalk. Inside, the store was dim and cluttered with barrels of flour, bolts of fabric, and farm tools hanging from the walls. Behind the counter, he found her. She was maybe 22, with honey-colored hair escaping from its pins and eyes the color of amber in firelight. She was pressed against the wall, one hand clutching her very pregnant belly, the other holding a small derringer that shook so badly it would not have hit anything even at point-blank range. Her face was pale, her breathing rapid, and Thomas could see the wet stains spreading down her skirt. "Your water broke," he said, stating the obvious because he did not know what else to say. "I know that," she snapped, fear making her voice sharp. "I am not stupid, just terrified and about to have a baby in the middle of a shooting." Thomas holstered his gun slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Shooting's over. You need a doctor. Dr. Morrison is in Denver for the week." Her face contorted with pain, and she doubled over, a low moan escaping her lips. When the contraction passed, she looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Please, I need help. The baby is coming now, not in hours. Now." Thomas Fletcher had faced down charging bulls, broken wild horses, and stared down the barrel of more guns than he could count. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the sheer panic he felt in that moment. He knew nothing about birthing babies except what he had seen with cattle and horses, and he was fairly certain human women would not appreciate being compared to livestock. "Where is your husband?" he asked, looking around as if the man might materialize from thin air. Her face crumpled. "Dead. Fever took him 3 months ago. I have nobody. Please, I cannot do this alone." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the terror and determination warring in her expression. She was alone, her husband was dead, and she was about to give birth in a general store during a bank robbery. If he walked away now, she might die. The baby might die. He had done many hard things in his life, but he could not do that. "All right," he said, moving toward her. My name is Thomas Fletcher. What's yours? Theresa, she gasped. Theresa Jenkins. Thank you. Thank you for not leaving. He wanted to tell her not to thank him yet, that he had no idea what he was doing, but another contraction hit her, and she cried out, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. Thomas supported her weight, feeling utterly helpless and more frightened than he had been during the shooting. We need to get you somewhere more comfortable, he said. Can you walk? She nodded, panting, and he helped her around the counter toward the back room, where the store owner kept his office and living quarters. The room had a small bed, probably for when old Mr. Henderson worked late doing inventory. Thomas helped Theresa onto it, and she immediately curled on her side, breathing hard. How far apart are the panes? Thomas asked, trying to remember anything useful from his limited experience with difficult calvings. Close, she managed. Maybe 2 minutes. It happened so fast. This morning I felt fine, just some backache. Then the shooting started, and I think the fear just brought everything on at once. Thomas stripped off his vest and rolled up his sleeves, trying to look more confident than he felt. All right, I am going to need water, clean cloth, anything you can think of that might help. Theresa pointed weakly toward a cabinet. Mr. Henderson keeps linens in there. There is a pump out back for water. Thomas moved quickly, gathering what he could find. He filled a basin with water from the pump, grabbed an armful of what looked like clean towels, and returned to find Theresa struggling to remove her heavy skirts. He helped her, trying to be respectful and efficient, though he could feel heat creeping up his neck. This was far more intimate than anything he had ever done with a woman, and certainly not in circumstances he ever could have imagined. Tell me what to do, he said, kneeling beside the bed. Theresa looked at him with frightened eyes. I do not know. This is my first baby. I was supposed to have help, supposed to have time to prepare. Oh God, it hurts. Another contraction seized her, and Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to do something, had to be useful, even though every instinct told him he was completely out of his depth. He grabbed her hand, letting her squeeze it as hard as she needed, and with his other hand, he pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. You can do this, he said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. You are stronger than you know. She let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. You do not know me at all. I know you are standing your ground when most people would have fallen apart, Thomas said. That takes strength. The next hour was the longest of Thomas Fletcher's life. He had no experience, no training, only instinct and determination. Theresa labored hard, her cries echoing in the small room, and Thomas stayed beside her through every contraction, every moment of pain. He spoke to her constantly, low and steady, the way he would calm a frightened horse, though his words were different. You are doing fine. Just breathe. I am right here. You are not alone. He wiped her face when she was burning up, held her hand when she needed to squeeze something, and tried to position himself to see what was happening without making her feel exposed or uncomfortable. When he finally saw the crown of the baby's head, his heart nearly stopped. The baby is coming, he said, his voice rough. When the next pain comes, you need to push. Theresa nodded, exhausted and scared, but there was determination in her eyes. When the contraction came, she bore down with everything she had, and Thomas supported the baby's head with shaking hands, terrified he would do something wrong. The baby emerged in a rush, slippery and red and screaming with outrage, and Thomas caught the tiny body with wonder and absolute terror. It is a boy, he breathed, staring at the impossibly small person in his hands. You have a son. Theresa reached for her baby, tears streaming down her face, and Thomas carefully placed the infant on her chest, using a clean cloth to wipe away the worst of the birth fluids. He had seen calves born, foals take their first wobbly steps, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming feeling that washed over him as he watched Theresa cradle her newborn son. The baby boy was perfect, with a thatch of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. He stopped crying almost immediately when he felt his mother's warmth, and Theresa looked down at him with such love that Thomas felt like an intruder on something sacred. Thank you, Theresa whispered, looking up at Thomas with exhausted gratitude. You saved our lives. Thomas shook his head, his throat tight. You did all the work. I just tried not to get in the way. He helped her through the rest, tying off the cord the way he had seen done with livestock. Though his hands were less steady than usual, he cleaned up as best he could, giving Theresa privacy to nurse her baby, while he disposed of the soiled linens and tried to make the room presentable. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, but he barely noticed. Everything felt surreal, like he had stepped into someone else's life for a few hours. By the time he finished, Theresa had drifted into an exhausted sleep, the baby tucked against her chest. Thomas stood looking down at them for a long moment, feeling something shift inside him that he could not name. He was not a soft man. Everyone in Aurora said so. Thomas Fletcher was hard as nails, cold as creek water in winter. Someone you wanted on your side in a fight, but not someone you would turn to for comfort. Yet here he was, standing over a woman he had just met, and the baby he had helped bring into the world, feeling more protective than he had felt about anything in his entire life. The sound of voices outside snapped him back to reality. The townspeople were emerging from their hiding places, and he could hear someone calling for the deputy. Thomas took one last look at Theresa and her son, then stepped out of the back room, closing the door quietly behind him. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, was standing in the middle of his shop, looking at the blood on the floor with horror. He was a small, round man in his 60s, with wispy white hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, his voice shaking. "What happened? I heard a woman screaming. Is someone hurt?" "Mrs. Jenkins just had her baby," Thomas said. "They are both fine, but they need rest and quiet. Do not disturb them unless she calls for you." Mr. Henderson's eyes went wide. "She had the baby here? During the robbery?" "Yes." Thomas picked up his hat from where he had dropped it earlier and settled it on his head. "She is going to need help over the next few days. Food, supplies, someone to check on her. Can you manage that?" Of course," Mr. Henderson said quickly. "Poor thing, losing her husband and now this. I will make sure she has everything she needs." Thomas nodded and turned to leave, but Mr. Henderson called after him. "Mr. Fletcher, what you did today, helping her like that, it was very kind." Thomas did not respond. He walked out into the afternoon sun, where a crowd had gathered around the two captured bank robbers. The deputy, a young man named Billy Carson, was trying to look official while tying their hands. "Mr. Fletcher," Billy called out, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you were here. You stopped them cold." Thomas ignored the praise, walking past the crowd toward the livery. His horse was still standing where he had left it, patiently waiting. He retrieved the reins and led the animal toward the stable, his mind elsewhere. He should have felt satisfaction at stopping the robbers, should have felt proud of helping Theresa, but all he felt was restless and unsettled, like something had broken open inside him that he did not know how to close again. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself unable to leave town. He told himself it was because his shoulder needed rest, that the wound should be checked properly. He told himself he needed to give a statement to the sheriff when the man returned. He told himself a dozen different things, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than any excuse. He could not stop thinking about Theresa Jenkins and her baby boy. On the third day, he went to check on them. He told himself it was just to make sure they were managing, that it was the decent thing to do. Mr. Henderson had set Theresa up in one of the rooms above the store, a small but clean space with a window overlooking the street. Thomas climbed the stairs, feeling awkward and out of place, his hat in his hands. He knocked, and Theresa called for him to enter. She was sitting in a rocking chair by the window, the baby in her arms, looking tired but infinitely better than she had 3 days ago. Her honey-colored hair was properly pinned now, and she wore a clean dress of simple blue cotton. When she saw him, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, standing carefully. "Please, come in. I was hoping you would visit." Thomas stepped inside, feeling too large for the small room. "I wanted to make sure you were doing well, both of you." "We are doing wonderfully, thanks to you." She looked down at her son with such love that Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Would you like to hold him?" Thomas took a step back, alarmed. "I should not. I might hurt him." Theresa laughed softly. "You delivered him into this world with your own hands. I think he will be safe with you." Before Thomas could protest further, she was placing the baby in his arms, adjusting his hold so the tiny head was properly supported. Thomas stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The baby boy was so small, so impossibly fragile, with delicate features and impossibly long eyelashes. He was awake, staring up at Thomas with unfocused eyes that seemed to see right through him. "What did you name him?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel, Theresa said. Samuel James Jenkins. It was my husband's father's name. Thomas looked down at little Samuel, and something inside him cracked wide open. The baby made a small sound, his tiny mouth opening in what might have been a yawn, and Thomas felt his heart do something it had never done before. He cradled Samuel close to his chest, supporting the small body with surprising gentleness. And in that moment, he felt like he was holding something infinitely precious, something worth protecting at any cost. Theresa watched him with soft eyes. "You are good with him," she said quietly. "I can tell you care." Thomas wanted to deny it, to say he was just being polite, but he could not lie. Not while holding this baby, who had already worked his way under Thomas's carefully constructed armor. "He is a fine boy," he said instead. "You should be proud." "I am terrified," Theresa admitted, sitting back down in the rocking chair. "I have no idea what I'm doing. My husband and I were supposed to do this together. We had plans, a little ranch outside of town, a future. Now he is gone, and I am alone with a baby and no real means to support us." Thomas looked up sharply. "What about your family?" "Dead or back east," Theresa said. "My parents passed from cholera when I was 16. I have a sister in Boston, but we have not spoken in years. She did not approve of me marrying a cowboy and moving west." Her voice was matter of fact, but Thomas could hear the loneliness beneath it. "What will you do?" he asked. Theresa shrugged, trying to look braver than she felt. "Mr. Henderson has offered me work in the store once I am recovered enough. It will not pay much, but it is honest work, and he says I can keep the room above the store. We will manage somehow." Thomas looked down at Samuel again, at this tiny boy who had no father, and a mother who was trying her best in impossible circumstances. He thought about walking away, going back to his life on the range, forgetting about the woman and child who had somehow become tangled up in his carefully ordered existence. He should do exactly that. It would be smart, safe, the thing everyone would expect from hard Thomas Fletcher. But when he looked at Theresa, seeing the strength and fear mingled in her expression, and felt the warm weight of Samuel in his arms, Thomas knew he could not walk away. Not now. Maybe not ever. "I could help," he heard himself say. Theresa looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Fletcher, you have already done so much." "Thomas," he corrected, "and I mean real help, not just checking in once or twice. I have money saved from working cattle drives. I could make sure you and Samuel have what you need." "I cannot accept charity," Theresa said firmly, pride straightening her spine. "I will not be a burden to anyone." "It is not charity," Thomas said, though he was not entirely sure what it was. "Consider it payment for room and board. I have been sleeping at the boarding house, but it is loud and the beds are terrible. You have space here, and I could use a proper place to stay for a while." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Theresa considered it carefully. "You would want to stay here, in the room next door?" "If you would have me," Thomas said. "I would not intrude on your space, but I could be nearby if you needed anything. Help with repairs, heavy lifting, that sort of thing." Theresa studied him for a long moment, and Thomas met her gaze steadily, letting her see that he was serious. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, but I insist on cooking for you and doing your laundry. If you are paying room and board, you should get something for your money." "Deal," Thomas said, relief flooding through him. Samuel chose that moment to start fussing, his small face scrunching up in displeasure. Thomas carefully handed him back to Theresa, who settled him against her shoulder, patting his back gently. Thomas watched them, feeling something settle in his chest that he had not known was unsettled. That was how it started. Thomas moved into the room next to Theresa's, a space barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was clean and quiet. He spent his days working odd jobs around town, fixing fences, helping with construction, anything that paid decent money. At night, he came back to the rooms above the store, where Theresa would have dinner waiting, and Samuel would be sleeping in his wooden cradle. At first, they were polite and careful around each other, two strangers brought together by extraordinary circumstances. But slowly, day by day, they began to relax. Theresa would tell him about her day while he ate, sharing small stories about customers in the store, or funny things Mr. Henderson had said. Thomas would listen, offering little of his own past, but absorbing every detail she shared. He learned that Theresa had grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a school teacher and her mother a seamstress. She had married David Jenkins when she was 19. lured west by his promises of adventure and a new life. They had been happy, she said, even though the reality of frontier life was harder than either of them had expected. David had worked on the same ranch where Thomas had spent the last 5 years, though they had different crews and rarely crossed paths. He was a good man, Theresa said one evening, looking down at her hands. Not perfect, but good. He tried so hard to build something for us. When he got sick, he fought it as long as he could. In the end, it just was not enough. Thomas wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to offer comfort, but he held himself back. It was too soon, too presumptuous. Instead, he said, he would be proud of you, of how strong you are being. Theresa's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Some days I do not feel strong at all. I feel like I am barely holding on. That is what strength is, Thomas said quietly. Holding on when everything in you wants to let go. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Thomas felt something pass between them, some understanding that went deeper than words. He cleared his throat and stood, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. I should check the door locks downstairs, he said. Make sure everything is secure. Theresa nodded, but there was a small smile on her lips, like she knew he was running from something he was not ready to face. As summer gave way to autumn, Thomas found himself settling into a routine he had never imagined for himself. He woke early, had breakfast with Theresa while Samuel slept or nursed, then spent his day working whatever job he had lined up. He was good with his hands and had a reputation for honest work, so there was never a shortage of things to do. In the evenings, he returned to the rooms above the store, where Theresa would be waiting, and Samuel was growing. Every day seemed to bring some small change, some new expression or sound that filled Thomas with wonder. He had never paid much attention to children before, had always assumed he would never have any of his own. But Samuel was different. Samuel was the baby he had brought into the world with his own hands, the tiny life he had protected in those first vulnerable moments. Thomas found himself helping with Samuel more and more. At first, Theresa would ask tentatively if he minded holding the baby while she cooked or cleaned. Then she stopped asking, simply handing Samuel over when she needed her hands free, trusting Thomas completely with her most precious possession. Thomas learned how to change diapers, though he grumbled about it for show. He learned the different kinds of cries, could tell when Samuel was hungry versus tired versus just wanting to be held. He learned to walk the room at night when Samuel was fussy, bouncing gently and humming old trail songs under his breath. The townspeople who saw him through the window, big rough Thomas Fletcher cradling a baby like it was made of glass, hardly knew what to make of it. The talk started almost immediately. Aurora was a small town, and people had little to do besides work hard and gossip harder. Thomas Fletcher, the man who never smiled, who could stare down a charging bull without flinching, was living with the widow Jenkins and her baby. Living with her, people said, with meaningful looks. The respectable ladies of the town began to whisper behind their hands when Theresa walked by. Mr. Henderson started getting questions about the propriety of the living arrangements. Thomas heard the gossip and his jaw tightened with anger, but Theresa just looked sad and resigned. I knew this would happen, she said one evening after a particularly pointed encounter at the store. Mrs. Morrison asked me directly when we were planning to marry, as if it was a foregone conclusion. Thomas looked up from where he was playing with Samuel, making faces that earned him gummy smiles from the baby. What did you tell her? That you were a lodger and a friend, nothing more, Theresa said. But I could tell she did not believe me. People see what they want to see. Does it bother you? Thomas asked carefully. The talk? Theresa was quiet for a moment. It bothers me that they think poorly of you for helping us. You have been nothing but kind and honorable, and they are treating you like you have done something wrong. What Thomas wanted to say was that he did not care what the town thought, that the only opinion that mattered was hers. What he actually said was, people talk, it is what they do, does not make it true. But the gossip continued, and Thomas could see it wearing on Theresa. She held her head high in public, but at home, she seemed smaller, more uncertain. Thomas hated seeing her doubt herself, hated that his presence in her life was making things harder instead of easier. One cold October evening, after putting Samuel to bed, Thomas made a decision. He found Theresa in the kitchen, washing dishes, and cleared his throat. I have been thinking, he said, maybe I should find another place to stay. The gossip is getting worse, and I do not want to damage your reputation. Theresa spun around, her eyes wide. You want to leave? No, Thomas admitted. But I do not want to make your life more difficult. You and Samuel, you deserve better than people talking behind your backs. Theresa dried her hands on her apron, her expression fierce. Thomas Fletcher, you listen to me. I do not care what those small-minded people think. You have been the best friend I could have asked for during the hardest time of my life. If you want to leave because you are tired of us, then go. But do not leave because of gossip. Thomas felt his heart hammering. I am not tired of you, either of you. Then stay, Theresa said simply, unless your reputation is worth more than our friendship. Thomas looked at her standing there in her simple dress, with her hair coming loose from its pins, her chin raised in defiance of anyone who would judge them, and felt something shift inside him. It was not a small shift, not a gentle repositioning. It was an earthquake, a fundamental change in the bedrock of who he was. He was in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere between delivering her baby and learning to change diapers, between shared meals and quiet evenings, Thomas Fletcher had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Theresa Jenkins. And it terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. I will stay, he said, his voice rough, for as long as you will have me. Theresa smiled, and Thomas felt the warmth of it all the way through. Good, she said, because Samuel would miss you terribly if you left. He adores you. Just Samuel, Thomas wanted to ask. What about you? But he held his tongue. It was too soon. She was still grieving her husband, still adjusting to being a mother. He could wait. He had learned patience on long cattle drives, had learned to wait for the right moment to gentle a wild horse or make a crucial decision. He could wait for Theresa to be ready, but waiting was harder than he had anticipated. Every day brought new moments that made his heart ache with longing. The way she laughed when Samuel grabbed her nose with his tiny fist. The way she hummed while she cooked, old songs from her childhood. The way she trusted him completely with her son, never hesitating to place Samuel in his arms. Winter came to Aurora with a vengeance, bringing snow and bitter cold. Thomas made sure their rooms were well heated, that they had plenty of firewood, that Theresa and Samuel had warm clothes. He worked harder than ever, taking on dangerous jobs in the cold because they paid better. He repaired roofs in freezing weather, helped drive cattle through snowstorms, did whatever it took to make sure Theresa and Samuel had everything they needed. Theresa scolded him for working too hard, for taking unnecessary risks. You are going to get yourself killed, she said one night, after he came home, half frozen from a particularly brutal day. She made him sit by the fire while she heated water for tea, her movements sharp with worry. I am fine, Thomas said, though his teeth were chattering. You are not fine. You are half frozen and exhausted. She thrust a cup of hot tea into his hands. Why do you do this to yourself? Because I love you, Thomas thought. Because I want to give you the world, and this is all I know how to do. But he said, someone has to provide for this family. The words hung in the air between them. This family. Theresa went very still, and Thomas realized what he had said. He waited for her to correct him, to point out that they were not a family, that he was just a lodger and a friend. Instead, she said softly, You already do more than enough, Thomas. I do not need you to kill yourself working. I need you safe and healthy. We both do. Thomas looked up at her, and in the firelight, her eyes were soft and warm. Theresa, he began, but Samuel chose that moment to wake with a cry, and the moment was broken. Christmas came, and Thomas bought presents for both of them. For Samuel, a small wooden rattle that he had carved himself during long evenings. For Theresa, a shawl of soft blue wool that he had seen her admiring in the store window. He agonized over the gift, worried it was too personal or not personal enough. But when she opened it on Christmas morning, her eyes filled with tears. Thomas, it is beautiful, but it is too much. It is not enough, he said quietly. Not nearly enough. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, and Thomas felt his heart racing. But then Samuel demanded attention, and the moment passed, leaving Thomas frustrated and uncertain. The new year of 1879 arrived with deep snow and howling winds. Thomas continued working, continued living in the room next to Theresa and Samuel, continued being part of their daily lives while maintaining a careful distance. The townspeople had mostly stopped gossiping, accepting their unusual arrangement as just another quirk of frontier life. Or Perhaps they had simply found something more interesting to talk about. In February, on a night when the wind screamed outside and the windows rattled with cold, Samuel developed a terrible fever. Theresa was frantic, walking the floor with her crying baby, trying everything she could think of to bring the fever down. Thomas rode through the storm to fetch the doctor, who had thankfully returned from Denver. Dr. Morrison came despite the weather, examined Samuel, and pronounced it a bad cold, but nothing life-threatening. "Keep him warm, give him plenty of fluids, and this fever should break in a day or two," the doctor said. "He is a strong baby. He will be fine." But Theresa could not rest. She sat up all night holding Samuel, refusing to put him down, terrified that if she stopped watching him for even a moment, something terrible would happen. Thomas stayed with her, feeding the fire, bringing her water, offering silent support. Near dawn, with Samuel finally sleeping peacefully and his fever beginning to break, Theresa looked at Thomas with exhausted eyes. "I do not know what I would do without you," she said. "When David died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would have to be strong and alone forever. But you have been here, every day, giving me strength I did not know I had." Thomas moved closer, sitting on the floor beside her chair. "You have always been strong. I just helped you see it." "No," Theresa said, shaking her head. "It is more than that. You have given us a home, a family. You have loved Samuel like he was your own son. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "He is easy to love." "And me?" Theresa asked softly. "Am I easy to love?" Thomas looked up at her, and in that moment, with dawn light beginning to seep through the windows and Samuel sleeping peacefully in her arms, he could not hide the truth any longer. "You are the easiest thing in the world to love," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you for months, Theresa. I have tried to hide it, tried to give you space and time, but I cannot pretend anymore. I love you. I love Samuel. I want to be part of your family, not as a lodger or a friend, but as a husband and father." Theresa's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I do not know if I am ready. David has only been gone less than a year. What will people think?" "I do not care what people think," Thomas said fiercely. "I care about you, about Samuel, about the life we could have together. But if you need more time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need." Theresa reached down and touched his face, her hand soft against his rough cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon, afraid I was betraying David's memory. But I love you. Thomas Fletcher, I love how gentle you are with Samuel, how hard you work for us, how you have never once made me feel like a burden. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you look at me when you think I am not watching." Thomas felt something break open inside him, something he had kept locked away his entire adult life. He stood up and very carefully took Samuel from her arms, placing the sleeping baby in his cradle. Then he pulled Theresa to her feet and into his arms, holding her close, feeling her warmth, her heartbeat, the reality of her against him. "Marry me," he said, "not because of gossip or propriety, but because I want to spend every day of my life making you happy. Because I want to be Samuel's father in truth, not just in practice. Because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Theresa pulled back just enough to look up at him, and Thomas saw joy and love, and yes, still some fear, but mostly hope. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will marry you." Thomas kissed her then, and it was nothing like the rough, urgent kisses he had shared with saloon girls in his younger days. This was gentle and reverent, a promise and a prayer all at once. Theresa kissed him back, her arms around his neck, and Thomas felt like he had finally found the home he had been searching for his entire life. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Aurora. The preacher, Reverend Williams, performed the service with genuine warmth. Mr. Henderson stood as Thomas's witness, and Mrs. Henderson stood for Theresa. Samuel slept through most of it, wrapped snugly in his mother's arms. Thomas had bought a ring, a simple gold band that cost him most of his savings. But Theresa cried when she saw it and told him it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He slipped it onto her finger with shaking hands, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas felt a surge of possessive joy so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. She was his now. They were his family, his responsibility, his heart. They moved to a small house on the edge of town, a simple place with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a parlor. It needed work, but Thomas threw himself into repairs with enthusiasm, wanting to make it perfect for his wife and son. Yes, son. In his heart, Samuel was as much his as if he shared his blood. He had brought the boy into the world, had cradled him in those first precious moments, had walked the floor with him at night and taught him to smile. Biology was irrelevant. Samuel was his son in every way that mattered. The first night in their new home, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle, Thomas and Theresa finally came together as husband and wife. Thomas had been with women before, quick encounters that meant nothing, and left him feeling empty. This was different. This was everything. He was gentle with her, mindful that it had not been that long since she had given birth, that she had been through so much. But Theresa met him with equal passion, her hands on his skin, her body welcoming him home. Afterward, lying tangled together in their marriage bed, Thomas felt a contentment he had never known existed. "Are you happy?" Theresa asked, her head on his chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his skin. "More than I knew it was possible to be," Thomas said honestly. "I spent years thinking I was not made for this, for love and family. Thought I was too hard, too cold. Turns out I just had not met the right people yet." Theresa propped herself up to look at him. "The town was so wrong about you. They said you could not be soft, that you did not have it in you to be gentle. But I saw the truth that very first day. I saw how you cradled Samuel like he was a prayer come true." Thomas felt his eyes sting, and he pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "He was," he said roughly. "You both were. I just did not know I was praying until you answered." They fell into married life with surprising ease. Thomas continued working various jobs around town and at the nearby ranches, building a reputation as a reliable hand. Theresa took in sewing and mending, working from home so she could be with Samuel. Money was tight, but they managed. They had each other, and that was worth more than gold. Samuel grew and thrived, becoming a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and laughed with infectious joy. He learned to sit up, then to crawl, and Thomas was there for every milestone, as proud as any father had ever been. When Samuel said his first word, "Dada," looking right at Thomas with his bright eyes, Thomas had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, Theresa found Thomas sitting on the porch, staring out at the night. She sat beside him, taking his hand. "He meant you, you know," she said softly. "When he said Dada, he meant you." "I know," Thomas said, his voice thick. "I am just grateful he will never remember a time when I was not his father." "You are his father," Theresa said firmly. "The only one he will ever know. David gave him life, but you have given him everything else." Thomas squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words for this woman who understood him so completely. The seasons turned, summer came again, hot and dusty, and Thomas worked on a cattle drive, gone for 6 weeks. It was the longest he had been away from Theresa and Samuel since they had married, and every day felt like an eternity. He drove the cattle hard, worked longer hours than anyone else, eager to finish the job and get home. When he finally rode back into Aurora, dusty and exhausted, he found Theresa waiting on the porch with Samuel in her arms. The baby, now almost a year old, did not recognize him at first and hid his face in his mother's shoulder. Thomas felt a stab of fear that Samuel had forgotten him, but Theresa laughed. "Give him a moment. He has been asking for Dada all week." She was right. After a few minutes of gentle coaxing, Samuel warmed up, and soon he was reaching for Thomas with chubby arms, babbling excitedly. Thomas took him, holding him close, breathing in the sweet baby smell, feeling complete for the first time in weeks. That night, after Samuel was asleep and Thomas had bathed away the trail dust, he and Theresa lay in bed together, and he told her about his decision. "That was my last long drive," he said. "I cannot spend weeks away from you and Samuel. It is not worth the money." "But we need the income," Theresa protested. "Those drives pay so well." "We will manage," Thomas said firmly. "I will find work closer to home, maybe start taking on more carpentry jobs, or hire on at one of the ranches that do not require long drives. I will figure something out. But I am done being away from my family for weeks at a time." Theresa kissed him, slow and sweet. "I missed you," she said. "The house felt empty without you." "Never again," Thomas promised. "From now on, I am a local man." He kept his word. Over the next year, Thomas built a reputation as an excellent carpenter and handyman. He took on projects building barns, repairing houses, constructing fences. The work was steady if not spectacularly lucrative, and it allowed him to come home every night to his wife and son. That was worth more than any amount of money. In the spring of 1880, Theresa told him she was pregnant again. Thomas was overjoyed and terrified in equal measure. He remembered too vividly the fear and panic of Samuel's birth, even though this time they would have proper medical care and a midwife. But Theresa was calm and confident. "I know what to expect now," she said, "and I have you. That makes all the difference." The pregnancy was easier than her first, without the stress and grief that had marked her time carrying Samuel. Theresa bloomed, her happiness evident in every line of her body. Thomas could not keep his hands off her, constantly touching her growing belly, feeling the baby kick, marveling at the miracle of it. Samuel, now a busy toddler, was fascinated by his mother's expanding belly. He would pat it gently and say, "Baby," one of his growing vocabulary of words. Thomas taught him to be careful, to understand that Mama had a little brother or sister inside her tummy who would come out to play soon. In November, during the first snow of the season, Theresa went into labor. This time, they were ready. The midwife, Mrs. Patterson, came to the house and took charge with calm efficiency. Thomas stayed with Theresa through the whole thing, holding her hand, wiping her face, encouraging her. It was still hard, still painful, but nothing like the terrifying emergency of Samuel's birth. After several hours of labor, their daughter was born, squalling indignantly at being forced from her warm cocoon. Thomas cut the cord himself this time, his hands steady, and when the midwife placed his daughter in his arms for the first time, he felt his heart expand to accommodate this new love. She was tiny and perfect, with wisps of blonde hair and her mother's amber eyes. Thomas cradled her close, this daughter who shared his name, if not his blood, and felt tears streaming down his face. He was not ashamed of them. This was his daughter, his baby girl, and he would protect her with his life. "What should we name her?" Theresa asked, exhausted but glowing as she held out her arms for the baby. Thomas carefully transferred their daughter to her mother, watching as Theresa settled her against her chest. "You should choose," he said. "You did all the hard work." Theresa smiled. "I was thinking Rose Elizabeth Fletcher, after my mother." "Rose," Thomas repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect. She is perfect." Samuel was allowed in to meet his new sister, and he was fascinated, touching her tiny hand with wonder. "Baby Rose," he said carefully, and Thomas felt his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. His family, his son and daughter, his wife, all safe and healthy under his roof. The years that followed were the happiest of Thomas Fletcher's life. He watched Samuel grow from a toddler into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and wanted to be just like his father. He watched Rose develop her own personality, fierce and independent even as a small child. He worked hard, providing for his family, building their small house into something more substantial. Theresa was his partner in every way that mattered. She ran their household with efficiency and warmth, raised their children with love and discipline, and was always there at the end of the day with a smile and a kiss. At night, after the children were asleep, they would talk for hours, sharing dreams and fears, making plans for the future. "I want to save enough to buy some land," Thomas said one night. "A small ranch, just enough for some cattle and horses. Something to pass on to Samuel and Rose." "We will get there," Theresa said confidently. "We have time, and we have each other. That is all we need." By 1883, Thomas had saved enough for a down payment on a small ranch about 5 miles outside Aurora. It was not much, just 80 acres with a weathered house and a barn that needed extensive repairs, but it was theirs. Thomas threw himself into fixing it up, working dawn to dusk, and the whole family helped. Even Samuel, now 5 years old, did his part, hauling small tools and fetching water. They moved in that summer, and Thomas felt a pride of ownership he had never experienced before. This was his land, his home, his legacy for his children. He bought a small herd of cattle and several horses, planning to breed and train them for sale. It would be hard work, but he had never been afraid of that. Theresa loved the ranch immediately. She planted a vegetable garden and flower beds, turning the dusty yard into something beautiful. She hung curtains in the windows and rugs on the floors, making the old house feel like home. Samuel and Rose ran wild, exploring every corner of their new property, and Thomas had never seen them happier. In the fall of 1884, Theresa told him she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear, only joy and anticipation. Their third child, a son they named James Thomas Fletcher, was born in the spring of 1885. The birth was quick and uncomplicated, and when Thomas held his new son for the first time, he marveled at how far they had come from that terrifying day in the general store when he had delivered Samuel with shaking hands and pure fear. Samuel and Rose adored their new baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him, who could make him smile first. Thomas watched his growing family with deep satisfaction. This was what he had been made for, not the lonely life of a drifting cowboy, but this: a wife who loved him, children who called him Papa, a home worth protecting. The ranch prospered. Thomas had a gift for training horses, and word spread about the quality of his animals. People came from neighboring towns to buy horses from Fletcher Ranch, and the money, while never abundant, was steady and reliable. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Years passed in a blur of seasons and growth. Samuel grew tall and strong, a natural horseman who loved working alongside his father. Rose was bright and determined, insisting on learning everything Samuel learned, refusing to be left behind because she was a girl. James was quieter than his older siblings, thoughtful and gentle, with a gift for music that amazed them all. In 1890, Samuel turned 12, and Thomas officially began teaching him the full responsibilities of running a ranch. They worked side by side, father and son, and Thomas felt a deep contentment knowing that everything he was building would continue after he was gone. Samuel would carry on the Fletcher name with pride. One evening that summer, as Thomas and Theresa sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, she leaned against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "Did you ever imagine your life would turn out like this?" she asked. Thomas thought about the hard, lonely man he had been before that day in 1878, before a bank robbery and a screaming baby had changed everything. "Never," he said honestly. "I thought I would die alone, probably shot in some stupid fight or crushed by a horse. I never dreamed I could have this, all of this." "The town was so wrong about you," Theresa said, echoing words she had spoken years before. "They said you could not be soft, could not be gentle. But I knew from the start. The moment you cradled Samuel in your arms, I saw your heart. You held him like he was a prayer come true." Thomas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "He was," he said. "You all were. I spent years thinking I was not made for love, that something in me was broken or missing. Turns out I just needed the right person to show me how to be whole." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was teaching Rose how to throw a lasso, while James sat on the fence, clapping and cheering them on. It was an ordinary moment, unremarkable in its simplicity. But to Thomas, it was everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Theresa asked softly. "Giving up your freedom, tying yourself to a widow with a baby?" Thomas turned to look at her, seeing the woman she had become over 12 years of marriage. She was more beautiful now than she had been at 22, her face lined with laughter and sun, her eyes holding the wisdom of a life well lived. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You and Samuel and Rose and James, you are the best things that ever happened to me. I was not free before I met you. I was just lost." Theresa kissed him, sweet and slow, and Thomas felt the same surge of love he had felt every day since that frozen dawn when she had asked him if she was easy to love. She was. They all were. More years passed. Samuel grew into a fine young man, steady and reliable, with his father's strength and his mother's warm heart. Rose bloomed into a beauty who could outride and outshoot most of the boys in the county, much to Thomas's pride and occasional worry. James pursued his love of music, teaching himself to play the guitar and bringing joy to the whole family with his songs. In 1895, Samuel met a girl named Elizabeth Carter at a church social. She was sweet and pretty, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and within months Samuel was head over heels in love. Thomas watched his son court Elizabeth with the same intensity he approached everything, and felt a bittersweet pang. His boy was growing up, building his own life. Samuel and Elizabeth were married in the spring of 1896, and Thomas stood beside his son at the altar, remembering his own wedding day nearly 2 decades earlier. After the ceremony, Samuel pulled Thomas aside, his eyes serious. "I never thanked you properly," Samuel said, "for everything you have done for me, for all of us." Thomas shook his head. "You do not need to thank me for being your father." "But that is just it," Samuel said. "You did not have to be. You could have walked away that day, let someone else help Mom, but you stayed, and you have been the best father anyone could ask for. I know I am not yours by blood, but I have never felt that mattered. You are my father in every way that counts." Thomas felt his throat tighten, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You have been my son since the moment you took your first breath in my hands," he said roughly. "Blood does not make a family, Samuel. Love does. And I have loved you every single day of your life." They embraced father and son, and Thomas felt the circle of his life coming around. He had been given a gift that day in 1878, a chance to be more than the hard, cold man everyone thought he was. Samuel and Theresa had given him that chance, and he had taken it with both hands and never let go. Samuel and Elizabeth built a house on the far corner of the Fletcher ranch, and soon they announced they were expecting a baby. Thomas was going to be a grandfather. The thought filled him with wonder and joy. He was only 46, still strong and vital, but the idea of holding his grandchild seemed to carry him forward into a new phase of life. Rose, now 17, had her own life ahead of her. She had been courted by several young men, but none had managed to win her fierce heart yet. Thomas secretly hoped she would hold out for someone truly special, someone who would appreciate her strength and independence rather than try to tame it. James, at 15, was still finding his path. He helped on the ranch when needed, but his heart was clearly more in music than cattle. Thomas encouraged him to pursue his passion, understanding that not every son followed in his father's footsteps. The important thing was that James was happy and true to himself. In the spring of 1897, Samuel and Elizabeth's baby was born, a healthy boy they named David Thomas Carter Fletcher, after Elizabeth's father and his grandfather. When Thomas held his grandson for the first time, he was transported back nearly 19 years to that chaotic day in the general store, when he had delivered Samuel with trembling hands and desperate prayers. He cradled little David with the same gentle reverence he had shown Samuel, supporting the tiny head, marveling at the perfection of new life. Theresa stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and when he looked up at her, he saw tears in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That we have built something beautiful," Theresa said. "That scared girl in the general store and that hard cowboy who did not know how to be soft. Look what they created. A family, a legacy, a love that just keeps growing." Thomas looked down at his grandson, then over at Samuel and Elizabeth, beaming with new parent joy, then at Rose and James standing in the doorway, watching with interest. His family, his impossible, wonderful family. "I cradled Samuel like he was a prayer come true," Thomas said quietly, echoing Theresa's words from years past. "Because he was. You all were. I did not know how to pray back then, did not even know what I was asking for. But somehow I got you anyway. All of you." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's careful management and Samuel's energetic assistance. Rose eventually met a schoolteacher named Michael Stewart, a gentle soul who loved her fierce spirit, and they married in a beautiful ceremony in 1898. James left for Denver to study music seriously, coming home for visits filled with stories of concerts and compositions. Thomas and Theresa grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening on their faces, but their love remained constant. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over their land, their grandchildren playing in the yard, and feel deeply content with the life they had built together. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Thomas turned 50. The family gathered at the ranch for a celebration, 3 generations of Fletchers filling the house with noise and laughter. Thomas stood in the middle of it all, watching his children and grandchildren, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas and Theresa lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. This was how they had slept for 22 years, tangled together, complete. "Happy?" Theresa asked, a question she had asked countless times over the years. "Always with you?" Thomas answered, the same reply he always gave. "Do you remember that first night when Samuel was just born and you asked me if you were easy to love?" "I remember," Theresa said softly. "I was so scared and alone. You asked if you were easy to love, and I told you that you were the easiest thing in the world to love," Thomas said. "That has never changed, not for a single day. You are still the easiest thing in the world to love, Theresa Fletcher." She tilted her head up to kiss him, and Thomas felt the same surge of love and desire he had felt since the beginning. "And you are the best man I have ever known," she said. "The town said you could not be soft, but I knew better. I saw your heart the moment you held Samuel. You cradled him like he was a prayer come true, and you have been cradling all of us like that ever since." Thomas held her closer, his throat tight with emotion. "Because you are," he said. "All of you. Every single day. I wake up and cannot believe this is my life, that I get to have this, have you, have all of it." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a life beyond anything either of them had dared to dream. More years passed in their gentle rhythm. Thomas watched his grandchildren grow, delighting in each milestone, each achievement. Samuel and Elizabeth had 2 more children, daughters who looked like their mother but had their grandfather's determined spirit. Rose and Michael had twin boys who kept everyone laughing with their antics. James eventually returned from Denver with a wife, a talented pianist named Catherine, and they settled in Aurora where James taught music and performed at local events. The ranch continued to thrive, now a partnership between Thomas and Samuel, with the younger man gradually taking on more of the daily operations as Thomas slowed down. Not that Thomas minded. He had worked hard his entire life, and it was satisfying to see his son carry on the legacy with such skill and dedication. In 1905, Thomas turned 55, and his body was starting to show the wear of decades of hard work. His shoulder, where that bullet had grazed him so long ago, ached in cold weather. His hands were stiff in the mornings, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of labor. But he was healthy and strong, and more importantly, he was surrounded by love. One summer evening, the entire family gathered at the ranch for Sunday dinner, a tradition they had maintained for years. The house was full of noise and chaos, children running everywhere, adults talking and laughing, food covering every available surface. Thomas stood back and watched it all, this beautiful mess of family he had helped create. Theresa found him standing alone on the porch and joined him, slipping her hand into his. She was 52 now, still beautiful to Thomas's eyes, though her hair was more silver than honey now, and her face was lined with the years of their life together. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand. "I was thinking about that day in 1878, the bank robbery, finding you in the general store, delivering Samuel. If someone had told me then that this would be my life 27 years later, I would never have believed them." "I would not have believed it either," Theresa admitted. "I thought my life was over when David died. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, struggling to raise Samuel by myself. Then you came along and gave me everything I thought I had lost." "We gave each other everything," Thomas corrected. "I was nothing before I met you, just a hard man with no purpose beyond the next job, the next dollar. You showed me what it meant to be soft, to be gentle, to love." Theresa leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside, they could hear Samuel calling for everyone to come to the table, hear the children's excited voices, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dishes. "We should go in," Theresa said, "before they eat everything without us." But Thomas held her there for another moment, wanting to freeze this perfect instant in time. "Thank you," he said softly, "for taking a chance on a hard cowboy who did not know the first thing about being a husband or father, for teaching me how to be soft when the whole town said I could not be, for giving me this life." Theresa turned in his arms and cupped his weathered face in her hands. "You were always soft, Thomas Fletcher. You just needed the right person to see it. The moment you cradled Samuel in your arms, holding him like he was a prayer come true, I saw the real you, the man you were always meant to be." Thomas kissed her then, sweet and lingering, pouring 22 years of love into that single kiss. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. "Come on," Thomas said, taking her hand. "Our family is waiting." They walked back into the house together, into the noise and chaos and love, and Thomas felt a deep peace settle over him. This was his life. This was his legacy. Not the ranch, not the money, not even the Fletcher name he had passed on. His legacy was love, was family, was the soft heart he had discovered beneath years of armor. The town had been wrong about Thomas Fletcher. They had said he could not be soft, could not be gentle, could not be anything more than the hard cowboy they saw on the surface. But Thomas had proved them wrong every single day since that afternoon in 1878, when he had cradled a newborn baby boy in his trembling hands and felt his heart crack wide open. He had cradled Samuel like a prayer come true, because that was exactly what the baby was. A prayer Thomas had not known he was praying, answered in the most unexpected way possible. And in return, he had been given everything: a wife who loved him, children who called him father, grandchildren who climbed into his lap and listened to his stories, a life rich with meaning and purpose. As Thomas sat down at the crowded table, surrounded by the family he had helped build, he caught Theresa's eye across the chaos. She smiled at him, that same warm smile that had captured his heart years ago, and Thomas smiled back, feeling the truth of it down to his bones. He had spent the first 28 years of his life building armor, becoming the hard man everyone expected him to be. He had spent the last 27 years learning to be soft, to be gentle, to love without reservation. And he knew without a doubt which version of himself was real, which life had meaning. The hard cowboy had been a shell, a protection against a world that seemed to demand toughness above all else. But the gentle father, the loving husband, the man who could cradle a baby like a prayer come true, that was his true self. That was who he had always been meant to be. Thomas Fletcher had been transformed by love, and in transforming, he had helped transform others. Samuel, who might have grown up fatherless and struggling, was now a confident man with a family of his own. Rose, who might have been limited by the expectations of her gender, was free to be fierce and independent. James, who might have been pressured into a life he did not want, was following his passion. And Theresa, who had lost everything and thought her life was over, had found happiness and security beyond her wildest dreams. The evening wore on, full of laughter and stories, and the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering. Children ran between the adults, dessert was served and devoured, someone started playing music, and soon half the family was singing along. Thomas sat in the middle of it all, his heart full, his life complete. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Thomas and Theresa prepared for bed. They moved through their nighttime routine with the ease of long practice, comfortable in each other's presence, no words necessary. When they finally climbed into bed, Theresa curled against Thomas's side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "I love you," Thomas said into the darkness. 3 simple words he had said thousands of times over the years, but they never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Theresa replied, her voice soft and content. "Forever." Thomas closed his eyes, listening to the sound of her breathing, feeling the warmth of her beside him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, he was exactly where he was meant to be, holding the woman he loved, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. The town had said Thomas Fletcher could not be soft. They had been wrong. He had cradled his newborn son like a prayer come true, and in doing so, had discovered a capacity for love and gentleness he had never known he possessed. That single act of tenderness had opened a door to a life beyond anything he had imagined, a life filled with love and family and belonging. As Thomas drifted off to sleep, his last thought was one of profound gratitude for Theresa, for Samuel, for Rose and James, for his grandchildren, for every moment of this beautiful, unexpected life. He had been given a gift that day in 1878, a chance to be more than what everyone expected. And he had taken that chance and built something extraordinary from it. The hard cowboy was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true strength came not from armor and walls, but from opening your heart and letting love in. Thomas Fletcher had learned to be soft, and in doing so, had found everything he had ever needed. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, Theresa warm beside him, the house quiet around them, and his heart full of love that would last beyond his lifetime, carried forward in the children and grandchildren who bore his name and his legacy. The story that had begun with a bullet and a bank robbery and a terrified young woman about to give birth had become a love story for the ages. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but because of steady, constant love shown every single day in 1,000 small ways. Thomas had learned that being soft was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all, and he had spent nearly 3 decades proving it with every action, every choice, every moment of gentle care for the family he loved. The town had been wrong about Thomas Fletcher, but Thomas and Theresa knew the truth, and they had built an entire life on that truth. A life of love, of family, of tenderness and strength combined. A life that started the moment Thomas cradled a newborn baby like a prayer come true and discovered who he really was beneath the hard exterior. A man capable of infinite gentleness, boundless love, and a devotion that would last all his days.